Hey there, amplifiers. One of the things I'm always advocating is to make sure that you're paying attention to your numbers. A lot of the times I'm looking at the 5 profit drivers, but sometimes we got to look at more data to get a better sense and make informed decisions. And our guest today is really an expert when it comes to looking at data and then making great decisions based on data. He's the founder of Practico Analytics, and he provides a lot of experience really helping business owners and executives take that data. He's even collected those thoughts in his book, The Data Mirage. And I'd like to welcome to Growth Amplifiers, Ruben Ugarte.
It's a pleasure to be here, Kenny.
It's a pleasure to have you. And as mentioned, as we were just chatting a moment ago, I've been looking through your book, and I've read a lot of business books, and I really appreciate what it is you're talking about. So let's start by really taking a moment to address the big idea of what we'll be talking about today, and giving a little bit more about kind of your background, and then we'll kind of go from there. Does that sound good?
That sounds good to me. Yeah. The book was written to, I think, address something that I was not seeing being addressed in other books. Mm-hmm. No company, no executive needs a pitch on the value of data. It's been hammered in for the past 20 years. I don't have to do that. And yet there's this gap, this discrepancy between what companies want to be doing, how they think they should be using numbers or using data, and what's actually taking place in their teams, in their day-to-day. So the book focuses primarily on what I think is a psychological challenge. How do you get your people to actually use the numbers, to trust them, to turn them into some kind of actionable insight, something that's tangible within the business? And there's a few different strategies around that. The book, of course, covers technology. It has to. We cannot talk about data without technology. But it's only one chapter out of 10. Mm-hmm. The other 8, 7 chapters, 9 chapters are all about how to use the numbers. What are the things that get in the way? What are the unexpected ways in which we look at statistics or work with statistics? So that is really the big idea behind the book.
I love it. A lot of the times when I'm connecting with business owners, I'm working with a lot of small business owners, and sometimes they just haven't been tracking data. So if they haven't been tracking data, all right, we got to start tracking. But even then, there's some that maybe have data. They have analytics. They have more data than they know what to do with, and they need a process to know, all right, now what? So let's start off by maybe identifying some of the biggest challenges you see right now that companies that you're working with are facing when it comes to data. What do you commonly see?
Well, it does change depending on company size. Do you want me to do maybe small business size, medium size, corporate size?
We'll take a poll of all three.
Okay. So I'd say on the small business side, probably the biggest challenge with data is similar to what you just said about no numbers, lack of data. It's really ambiguity. That is, they're not quite sure what to do with the numbers or what numbers to even collect. What should they be focusing on? And I think the ambiguity that makes it harder to improve. Let's say your business is not doing as well. Demand is going down or revenue is going down. Without some kind of tangible breakdown of that, you're dealt with this really tough problem, this ambiguous problem with no place to start. But if you were to say a restaurant and you're tracking the number of course, sales per day, number of people who visit, number of orders or checks, as I might call them, and you start to see that on the breakdown by daily basis or weekly basis, you can start to kind of figure out what might be happening, right? That maybe your Mondays are really slow compared to your Fridays. Perhaps you should close down your Mondays. It makes no financial sense to be open on Mondays. Or perhaps you should have different offers on Mondays versus Fridays to drive more people. That's, I think, where small businesses need to start with a very tangible, concrete, this is what's working, this is what's not. What data do we have already that is not on ours to track, right? I think asking a small business to, track how many people are walking through the door manually is a tough sell. But
Mm-hmm.
if you tell them, hey, you already have your POS data, your payment processing, or your CRM, or whatever you're already using day to day, just find a way of getting the data out and visualizing it into something that's tangible, that's easy to understand.
Awesome. I think that's a good starting point. I know sometimes people can get overwhelmed, or they can be challenged to think, how can I do this? I don't have the time or the resources.
Yeah.
But I like what you had in your book. I think it was page 83. I made note of it in my mind because it was, just, I'm actually going to pull it up now. I'll see if I'm right. Less is more. Yes, I was right. Less is more. It's better to start with a shorter report that you can add to over time than to simplify a complex report. And I think a similar approach could be said about, beginning to collect data. Starting small to crawl, walk, run would be better than trying to, I want to do everything and run right into a wall.
Exactly, yeah. And, the smaller you are, this really applies even to large teams, Fortune 500.
Mm-hmm.
You have limited time at the end of the day. And it's important to understand that unless your job title has the word data, you're a data analyst, a data scientist, a data engineer, data is not your full-time job. So you're a marketing person, you're a salesperson, you're a small business owner. You already have a job of actually running your business or running your team or whatever else you're doing. So data is really meant to help you and support you in that, not completely take over your job unless you're going to become a data analyst. So I do think, yeah.
I was just going to say, but to climb to the next, finish that thought, and then climbing to the next ladder to the medium-sized business would be good insights as well. Because I think this is something that everyone can benefit from listening to, and depending on where they're at, they may get a different takeaway.
Exactly, yeah. So a medium-sized business, now you have like teams, different kinds of teams, maybe multiple teams under different departments. For them, the challenge starts to be more technology based. That is, they might not have the right technology. Their CRM might just be really outdated. I work with companies where their technology was clearly chosen 10 years ago, and it's become a very strong hindrance now to what they do. It's just everything is really hard. So technology is one thing for them. The second thing is now you have more people, and now training becomes much more important. You need to be able to give people just basic skills. I'm always surprised how many people I run into that actually do not like statistics. They do not like math, even basic math. And that prevents them from just working with numbers, right? They just don't want to do it. It's just not within their wheelhouse, but that can be trained. That's a skill that can be trained. Again, you're not here to become a data scientist with advanced math, PhD level math, but just a basic understanding of numbers, statistics, how numbers can be tweaked, how they can lie to you, how to ensure that doesn't happen. And the third thing for a medium-sized business is aligning the data with the strategy much more. At that point, you likely have a strategy of some kind, right? 1, 2, 3 years. Here's the markets we want to go into. Here's the products we want to develop. So how does data play a role into that in the formulation of the strategy? And of course, the measurement of the strategy as that is happening. And that may be as simple as having someone, join the executive team that represents the data team or represents the data in general, right? Having an owner in the executive team that owns the data. And it could be as complex as having an entire team or a full-time person who's making sure that this data is flowing in the strategy. So those are medium-sized businesses. You sort of have this growth stage where you have data, there's no lack of data, but it's not being fully utilized. It's not reaching every person in the most effective way.
I could see that would be a challenge. You've got people you're putting into task, and without making sure there's a plan, more often than not, I've had the opportunity to connect with some larger businesses as well, and they have maybe their internal marketing team, their marketing agency, their sales team, and their management, and they're working on things, but they're not all on the same page. And there's a lot of disconnection, and it seems like in their minds they seem like they're on the same page because they're all kind of like working towards a common goal, but how they're going about doing it and how the information that they're sharing isn't all on the same page. So that's an important part. Now, I personally haven't done a lot of work working with corporations, but I'd be curious to know kind of like what goes on as you climb up higher in the ladder there.
Yeah. So once we get to larger companies, now some problems get magnified, others get resolved. Typically, a larger corporation, let's say Fortune 500, just for our sake of examples here, you will have data people in the corporation. Of course, you're going to have data teams in the corporation. It might not be a large team. It might be 4 or 5 people, maybe 10 people, but you'll have actual teams. So technology is typically resolved, let's say more or less. You can find the right technology, you can implement it. You have lots of data. So their challenges come from, one, not diving too much into the advanced usage of data. So this is where machine learning, data science is where it becomes a real advantage to be able to run this. And it might have a significant impact on the company and how it thinks about products. But if you don't have the right structure, the right teams, the right people in the right places, that will not happen. You'll be sort of limited to just reporting, just sort of saying what happened and what's going on. The second thing that comes up in larger corporations is silos. Once you get large enough, now you have sort of real power within individual teams or departments, and silos will come up. Compliance or legal might actually be a thing, at this companies, and they might have a strong power over how data gets shared or doesn't get shared among teams. So now you have all this data that could be useful, but it's separated in silos. And the third thing that you'll see at this level is what's almost like an abstraction. So you have a data analyst or people who are creating reports, and those reports are everywhere, but the executive team might not have enough data proficiency to sort of take in those numbers and use them. And because they don't work with the numbers directly, they only get the summaries, they only get the reports. They might be missing things. They might be missing opportunities within the data. It's just there's so many layers of people that it just doesn't surface all the way up. So that becomes more of a communication problem than less a data problem. But that's what tends to happen in larger corporations. So you can see how it goes from small to medium to large. It will kind of gets harder and harder as you have more and more data and more people.
And that's where someone like yourself, a guide, can really help and kind of get someone to take all that information and put it into a process that is really effective for their organization or their business. Sometimes they may be doing things, but a lot of the times when I'm connecting with someone, they may know things, they may already be doing things, but there's gaps in what they're doing that are limiting the potential of what they could be doing. So, and that's the concept of behind growth amplifiers. You have gaps, and if you take the time to step back and assess, you can see, hey, if I made a few adjustments in these few areas, it could have a big impact on the overall result.
It's something interesting that just triggers something in my mind is the difference between people and teams. So at a large corporation, you will have teams that use data really well, and everyone will know who they are. They are sort of the data-driven teams. They do it really well, and then you have teams that are not as good. So you have an average. You have people above the average and people below the average. So for sometimes the companies, especially as they get larger, it's not really about bringing in new things from the outside, bringing in new best practices around how to collect data and how to store it and how to report it. It's really about finding those internal best practices. Who does it really well, and how do we bring those ideas? Because clearly those ideas work within the culture, right? Within the culture and the constraints of the company, those teams have made it work. How do we bring that down to the next sort of tier of teams and help them close their gaps? And of course, even a medium-sized company, maybe to an extent, a small business can do the same, where you have people who are really good and people who are not as good with data. What is the difference between them, and how do you bridge that gap? And that could be much easier and much more effective than trying to introduce a new idea from the outside, some kind of like foreign idea into the ecosystem of a company.
Got it. So don't fix it if it's not broken.
Yeah.
Find some adjustments in the key areas. Optimize it, right? So what can data do and not do for companies in general?
Well, I think data can help you support ideas, can help you provide guidance as to what to do or what you should be doing, and it can help surface opportunities that you may not see, things that may be very clear patterns in the data. Perhaps, let's say, I work with companies where their usage, their engagement with customers is very high during weekdays, sometimes even very specific days, as in we can see all the usage, or a significant portion of the usage happens between 8 and 10 a.m. in the morning, and then again at 4 or 5 p.m. This was a payment processing company that I work with, and there's no usage in the weekends. So that can start to give you ideas as to how you should design your products, how to engage with customers, how your product might be fitted into their daily routine, right? On the other hand, there's several things that data cannot do, and where I think there's misconceptions around expectations. One, it cannot really tell you the answer all the time. It might give you good ideas, maybe even a strong validation that this is the way to go, but it doesn't always work that way, right? I worked with tourism companies last year, 2020, at the height of the pandemic. Very tough industry. I mean, their numbers were 90% down, which they had never been like that ever in history, right? So there was literally no data that could tell them really what to do or what not to do. They had no idea what was going to happen next week in terms of government regulations, or even next month. And of course, even today, tourism is still very uncertain. So relying on data all the time for answers is eventually going to backfire, especially when you run into this, we might call them black swan events, right. Unexpected things that no one knew, but they do happen somewhat consistently. We don't know when they will happen, but we know they will happen on some kind of frequency. So relying on data, and I know there's teams that were very data driven really struggle last year, because it was almost like they lost this, their light, their torch, and now they had no idea how to navigate in the dark.
Where are we?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. You were in the cave without a light. And not sure. And really the best teams, they just kept moving, right? They were like, we're not sure if moving to e-commerce from our physical store is going to help. We have no idea how to do it, but we might as well do it and see how it works. And sort of adjust as we go along, right? Using your words that you were using before. So relying on data for everything will eventually backfire. I think relying on data too much can also backfire. If you have an executive with 30 years of experience in an industry, and they come with an idea around something, a new product, a new customer segment, but they have no data to back it, you shouldn't dismiss the idea altogether. There's still something there that they're pulling from, right? Some experience, some qualitative, maybe intuition. So if you have a culture that only uses data, and I've been in those companies, there's a phrase from Edwin Denman where it says, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. If you sort of believe that you will also reject ideas that in hindsight made no sense, but now they end up working. So that's what can happen with data. There's a good role to it, but I also seen too many companies take the role to an extreme, and it will eventually limit them in some way.
So for those who are maybe thinking, we need to get a little bit more of a plan, what are some ways or some best practices for how to determine the best tools for your product or industry?
Okay, from a technology perspective. Yeah. So technology is a rabbit hole. There's so many options. Even someone like myself who spends, day in, day out, I constantly come across technology that I've never seen before. So it's a challenge. I would think about a few things. One, I would start by looking at what is the standard tech stack in your industry. So if you go online, if you talk to peers, maybe even conferences or events, you will find typical tech stacks. That is, this is what e-commerce company does. This is what a SaaS software company does. This is what a mobile company does. This is what a manufacturing company does. typically speaking. And you have likely 4 or 5 different pieces. We need something to store customer data. We need something for email. We need something for our physical payment processing on the coffee shops. And you start to build a stack from there. I would then look in every of those 4 or 5 categories. I would look for sort of the 2 or 3 major players that fit your segment. So every category might have 100 players, but really there's always 2 or 3 that tend to dominate 60, 70, 80% of the conversation. Those are the ones I tend to recommend to clients for a few reasons. One, they're production ready. They've been around for a long time, so they have more functionality. Their pricing might be higher because they're an established player, but you're trading pricing for stability, which is not a bad trade-off. So I will look for those, and then make a choice, and then adjust. Of course, you might realize that a technology choice was not the right one, and you need to adjust. But that's how I've recommended to companies to approach technology. Less so, what are all the options available to us, and let's gauge them, and more, what are peers doing? What are successful peers doing? And how can we emulate what they're doing while kind of matching it to what we want to do?
I think that's great advice, and just kind of getting in there and trying it out. I've had some companies like paralysis by analysis. They're trying to find the perfect fit before they make a selection on moving something forward. And in my experience, perfection is really not obtainable. There's always going to be like something that maybe is a little better in one platform versus another. There's pros and cons with almost anything you choose, or even perceived pros and cons at the very least. And by just knowing what your immediate needs are, and I think getting like the peers insights, and then making a selection and getting started, you're going to learn from going through that experience versus trying to find that perfection fit and then not making any progress. That's been one of the things I've seen, because at the end of the day, a lot of times what I'll share as well is the tool is not as important as how you're using it and leveraging it. And which leads me to my final question is, how do you uncover actionable insights from your data? You have these tools, you get the data. How do you discover the actionable insights to kind of like know, well, that's nice. Now what?
Yeah. There's lots of techniques here that sort of get into the world of statistics and how to visualize the data. Let me share a few that tend to resonate well with clients and companies. So we assume that we have data, we have reports, so we can build reports of some kind. So we can build dashboards and things like that. The things we want to be looking for, first, in no particular order, you want to start to dive behind the averages. So a lot of the KPIs that companies look at are averages of some kind. What is the average sales value? What is the average lifetime value of our customer, or the average cost of acquisition? Averages. And this is great because averages tell you roughly where you are, and you can do math on them and models and projections. But as we talked before, there is, of course, users or customers above the average and below the average. And in particular, the ones above the average are the most interesting to look at. So if you have an average lifetime value of $100, who's above that? And what are the sort of characteristics behind those people? So who are sort of the top 10% of customers above the average, and who are they? What are the demographics, the psychographics? How do they find you? What is sort of the attribution on them? How do they use your product, right? Is there use cases here that are different from what you expect? And I find a lot of companies like to focus on what's effectively the bottom 10%, right? They want to know why people didn't convert, why people didn't close a deal, why people didn't say yes to this specific offer. And that's in one way somewhat interested, but I think it's much more interesting to look at why people converted and how to find more of those people, really, in essence. So going behind your averages, effectively any average, you really want to understand what's going on. And the same can be said for traffic acquisition or user acquisition. what are the campaigns that are below the average in cost, cost of acquisition, and how do they differ from the most expensive campaigns? And you start to find some insights or things to try, or at least assumptions to explore. The second thing to start finding insights is to look at trends within the data. So once you have some data, being able to look at some of the initial trends, specifically spikes or drops. So if there's a spike in traffic, or there's a spike in usage, or a spike in purchases, you want to be able to understand why. What drove that spike? Were you mentioned by some external factor, some external media side, or did something happen in the market? I work right now with a cryptocurrency company, and their product is very market driven, as you can imagine. Elon Musk tweet about Bitcoin, and it goes up, it goes down. So for them, trying to understand those spikes is actually quite helpful. And it's a tricky thing to do. It's not easy. But then they can start to say, what? It seems like when this few people tweet about crypto, we should then run some kind of offer, a notification, a message alongside that maybe mentions that, to kind of make the most of that potential spike. So whatever spikes or drops might be happening in your business, you want to stay on top of them and understand what's causing them. And the third thing I'll mention, just to sort of round up this idea of finding insights, it's less so a technique and more so making the data easily available. So that is, companies want to have dashboards, and those are great. But you should really think about putting the data into as many formats as possible. So that means having email digests that go out once a day or once a week, having Slack messages that send you notifications with the latest numbers, dashboards, of course, maybe text messages, whatever else. And by making it easy where people look at the numbers consistently, then they'll actually start to notice patterns, right? Because we are basically pattern finding machines as humans. So if you look at numbers every week and you start to notice the ups and downs, you're like, usually this number is 100, today is 110, last week was 90. You start to kind of gauge and connect how the things that you might be doing are affecting the numbers on a daily or weekly basis. And that will start to have a bit of a feedback loop where you say, hey, we ran this campaign last week. Here's how the numbers changed or didn't change, or we did that the previous week. So that, I think, is also a way of making the data much more useful, much more actionable by becoming more acquainted with it. And executives will tell you this, right? They know the numbers inside and out. So when things go up slightly, up and down, they're very in tune to those changes. So they know exactly what might be causing it or not causing it.
Very helpful. Now, those who are tuning in who are thinking, maybe I've got some work to do with how I can improve and use my data. If they want to learn a little bit more about you and what you do, where could they go? What could they do?
The main place is my website. That is rubenugarte.com, RubenUgarte.com. And you'll find links to the book. The book is available everywhere you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. Yeah, you get a picture right there. And the website also has other free resources, blog posts, podcasts, videos, templates. So there's a lot of things to explore and tools that you can use to start to level up your data next month.
I think it's great. It's all about amplifying it. You're already doing the right things. You're taking the right actions. You're going to start to keep score. You're keeping score. Then now how can you use those different scores and those pieces of data to make the adjustments you need to continually optimize and improve? That's what we're looking to do. Ruben, you've been really, really helpful. You've shared a lot of knowledge. Mic drop. If I could get you to end our time just by sharing one more piece of advice that you might give others who are on their journey of how, something that you've learned on yours.
I would say something that's always been really helpful is trying to differentiate the learnings that you come across. That is, there's of course successes, failures, if you want to use that word, but trying to understand what happened there. I think this is the very first idea we cover about ambiguity. Knowing that you sort of succeed or fail is interesting. Knowing why that happened while removing the ambiguity, I think, is much more useful. So knowing if this is a skill issue, right, you need to learn a specific skill. Maybe it's a an interest issue, you just don't have any interest in a specific area or topic, and separating them. And I think that makes progress much more easier from a learning perspective.
Excellent. Ruben, thank you very much for your time and contributing to Growth Amplifiers. We appreciate you. Please make sure if you're tuning in to check out Ruben's website, rubenugarte.com. It's in the book. If you can't see if you're not watching the video, if you're streaming in later, it is The Data Mirage, Why Companies Fail to Actually Use Their Data. It's great, good content. I don't always endorse books if I get them and they're not that great, but this is a good one that I found very insightful. So thank you again for your time, and it's been an honor having you join us on Growth Amplifiers.
Thank you for having me, Kenny.
To show your support, take a moment to amplify this message by sharing it online. To connect with me or gain more business growth insights, visit www.growthamplifiers.com. Thank you for your support.